Hello and welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast, where we invite you to spend just a few minutes with the staff at Cook Library. I'm Daniel Smith, the genealogy librarian, and you are listening to the Local Genealogists Speak podcast series. In this episode, we are hearing from local genealogists about their experiences doing family history research. We are also listening for their tips and suggestions for doing genealogy. As a librarian, I am convinced that we all learn from each other, and we all have valuable information to share. By the way, this episode will be a part of a larger series of interviews with local genealogists, so be on the lookout for others. Today, I am joined by Kim, a local genealogist who has graciously agreed to answer questions about her favorite ancestor, her favorite type of genealogy record, the Daughters of the American Revolution, or DAR, and more. In honor of the 250th anniversary of the United States, Kim will also share a favorite part of American history. Thank you for joining us today, Kim. As we begin, I'd love to ask you, why did you start researching your family history?
Well, thank you for having me here today, Daniel. As a child, I was always really interested in history, but when I was in junior high school, that's when the miniseries show Roots aired for the very first time. And for my mom and I, that was definitely appointment TV. But I also had a junior high school social studies teacher at the time, Mrs. Musgrove, who really kind of connected with the buzz and made it a teachable moment. And she gave us a family tree project. And that was the first time that I was introduced to a genealogy chart. She taught us how to fill it out and then really walked us through how to sit down and interview different family members so that we could do as much as we could to get that chart filled out. And so that experience really just always kind of stuck with me, like what I had learned, how to organize that information. I enjoyed the questions that I was able to get answered, but then there were the questions that couldn't get answered. And for some reason, those have always stuck with me. As I got older and I headed off to college, I majored in history. I would become a social studies teacher, and I was mostly teaching about the early American period up through the U.S. Civil War, and always kind of wondering about, did my family have any connection to those kinds of things? And then in 2010, I started watching a TV show that heavily promoted Ancestry.com. And so one night, I decided to log in and take advantage of their free membership for a short period of time. And I remember that at 3:30 in the morning, I had to go to bed because I had gone back 5 generations, met people that I didn't know about and had not heard about. But the person that I had met that night that really captured my interest was my 3 times great-grandfather. His name was Riley. And I discovered him in the 1860 census as being a 17-year-old living with his parents in New York. And my knowledge of history said a year after that census was the U.S. Civil War, and that President Lincoln was going to call for volunteers. Did my ancestor answer that call? And so I kept digging that night, and I found that he did. And he served as an infantryman. He volunteered in December of 1861, and he would serve out through the remainder of the war. So he was a pretty interesting character, but I was definitely hooked on online research for my family tree at that point. And so I kept sticking with it. I would eventually find someone who that Civil War ancestor, his sibling, had a descendant that we connected with who had been doing genealogy for a long time. And he said, "Here, did you know this is where the family line goes?" And so I learned that my ancestors go all the way back to 1632. That was when my first ancestor arrived. And so I've been interested in trying to fill in all the blanks ever since.
That's an amazing journey. I love how many people were inspired by the TV series Roots. You hear that a lot. It sounds like you're kind of talking a little bit about some of your favorite ancestors, but I am curious about who your favorite ancestor is.
I think I would have to go back to that ancestor, Riley, he really just kind of hooked me and then launched me back. I see his journey after the war is over, that he moves his family to Kansas Territory. Wow. And he sets up a lumber business. He would also get elected mayor of the town. And that election, I had to chuckle when I read the newspaper article because it was the first time the women in Kansas were allowed to vote. It was a state election in the late 1800s, and they were hoping the women weren't going to mess it up. And they were surprised that only one bad ballot had been cast, and it wasn't a woman. So I kind of appreciated that little insight into history because it spoke about more than just my family, but it spoke about the times in which they lived. And so he was really very interesting. And then eventually, as I looked back and learned about his father, it was a little bit of a struggle to kind of go back because all of a sudden I was starting to kind of hit a brick wall. I had a name from the census, but then about that time, 1840, we don't see everybody's name. So that's kind of where things started to get a little bit murkier. But I eventually would break through and discover that Riley's grandfather is a man named Joseph, and Joseph had served in the American Revolution. And so that then really caught my attention as well. And I saw in the Cook Memorial Library Ins and Outs brief that the Daughters of the American Revolution hold a drop-in genealogy session here every month. And so I decided to take advantage of it to see if this ancestor, Joseph, that I was very curious about, might lead me to being able to join Daughters of the American Revolution.
Wow, thank you for plugging the library programs. I really do appreciate that. And it sounds like you've done, with the research you've done, you've used a lot of different types of genealogy records, and we rely on genealogy records, or records in genealogy all the time to find out information about our family. I'd love to know, we've spoken about your favorite ancestor, but what about a favorite type of genealogy record?
So I'm now a volunteer genealogist with our DAR chapter that comes here to hold workshops at the Cook Memorial Library. And one of the things when we have someone new come in who's interested in researching for a patriot ancestor is I do like to try and start with census data. Those are really great places for us to kind of help track back their family because, again, when we can see relationships, which is one of the key things we have to prove for the DAR, is those filial relationships. Census data can be very, very valuable.
I love, with census records, I love how each one can tell you a little bit about a family. And thankfully, a lot of census records are now available online. We don't have to go visit a library or request microfilm. But it does sound like you've had some luck going to a library or archive and finding resources and research that's helped you with your genealogy. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, Cook Library has some great resources and some really helpful online databases and some of the access points that we've been able to have. And once I was connected in with the DAR, I learned about a lot more of those kinds of resources. So the DAR itself has open to the public many resources if you're trying to research for a patriot ancestor, if you're trying to look back, because all of those descendant lines for people who are no longer with us can be seen. So if someone hears like, oh, I have an aunt or I had a grandmother who is a member of the DAR, we can actually go in on that public-facing side of the website and we can see what that family line looks like there. But then also coming here, we use things like Family Search, which has been extremely helpful to be able to do a lot of that research here because this is a partner site. And I've been able to get documents that I couldn't get at home just by logging in through a personal account with Family Search. And then I think one of the things I kind of did was it's also inspired me to travel a bit, to be able to start to look up and learn a little bit more, also see the places where my ancestors came from. So even this summer, hard to believe that I went to Boston for the first time this summer with one of my nieces. And one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to see some of the things that might connect us back to our ancestors who had lived in the Boston area. And before that, I had discovered through Find a Grave that one of the 6 old burying grounds in the Boston area in Dorchester is where a number of our ancestors were buried. And so we found a number to call, and they gave us access to this very old burying ground from the 1600s. And so we got to go in and we got to actually see the headstones of our ancestors, people that we are descended from 8, 9, and 10 generations. So there's multiple generations that were there. And just being able to see that was really just very moving. It really connected us to our ancestors and to our family lineage in a really powerful way.
I've loved hearing about your trip to Boston, and I love that it was a multi-generational sort of experience for you. And I think that I'm really excited. Even I've been to Boston before, but one of the things I really want to go and see is, and you got the chance to see it, is going to the kind of the new center that the American Ancestors has. I'm really excited after hearing you about your experience about going and doing that for myself.
I would highly encourage you to do that. And one of the great things is if I hadn't stopped in there, I couldn't have gotten the phone number I needed to be able to go to the Dorchester Burying Grounds. And so they were extremely helpful and just really wonderful people and a great resource. I'd love to go back one day and actually use the library and dig in and do some great research there.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I'm really excited. I know that we get a chance to see their webinars sometimes and hear those, but we don't always get a chance to visit. So I encourage folks to do that if you have the time and energy and motivation, and if it makes sense for your own research. And then one of the last questions I want to ask you is, how has being a member of the DAR been a valuable part of your genealogy research? I know that we've heard a little bit about some of your DAR work, but I'd love to hear about how that's helped you in your own genealogy.
Well, when the first time I stopped in here to the library for the workshop, I was greeted so very warmly, and they said, okay, show us what you've got so far. And all the work that I had done was honored, and they really then helped me see where were the different holes in my research that I still needed to fill. They were really great in really helping me to make sure that I had good, solid, accurate data, and then just also going in and being introduced to new resources to be able to dig in and expand my knowledge base on what you can use for good quality genealogy research. I also learned from them. I remember signing my application thinking I was done, and our registrar saying to me, okay, well, now you need to start working on your supplementals. And I said, what are supplementals? And she said, well, you know, if you have one Patriot ancestor, you likely have many more. And I said, well, how do you figure that? And she talked me through the math of genealogy, how you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. So going back 8 generations as I was to my Patriot ancestor, Joseph, there are 128 ancestors at that generation. But it's very likely that there are additional generations that were also there and involved in the war. And if I go back to the 9th, that's 256. And so I was really glad that I was encouraged, because using the DAR resources, I began to discover that, in fact, I have more Patriot ancestors than just that one. I'm currently working on 3 supplemental applications back to 3 different Patriot ancestors. And I'm excited that I have a whole bunch more potential ones to also research.
Thank you for sharing more about your experience with the DAR. And I love the concept of genealogy math, especially coming from someone who was a previous history teacher. And as a history teacher, I would love to know, in honor of America 250, what your favorite aspect of American history is, if you could pick one.
Oh, if I could pick one, I think back about what my favorite units were to teach. And my favorite unit every year was the unit on the Constitution. I loved it because it came out of the roots of the American Revolution, because so many of the things that caused the American Revolution land in our governmental document. And to really just take my students through that era and launching a brand new nation and how exciting that was, but then also to be able to say, and look how far we've come. So that was really my favorite era of American history.
I love that. I love how your professional life in some way, of course, influences our own personal life, and how learning history, of course, we know can influence and help us in our own genealogy research. So thank you for sharing just briefly about that. We hope that you have enjoyed listening to and learning from Kim. Hopefully you are also inspired by something she shared or said. Maybe she even gave you an idea to help further your own research. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with those who you think would also be interested. One of the best things you can do to support us is to take a moment to comment or leave a rating for this podcast. Those comments and ratings help get this podcast noticed. We'll be back soon, but until then, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.